Welcome back to Spilling Tea. Today's episode is part one of a two-part series, and this one, it requires a little honesty, a little self-reflection, and a willingness to sit with discomfort without immediately defending yourself. Because today, we're talking about intimacy and entitlement, and the quiet, almost invisible ways relationships begin to fall apart long before anybody says it out loud. This isn't a blame episode, and it's definitely not a drag session. It's not about choosing sides either. It's about patterns, clarity. It's about naming the thing behind the thing. So let's take a deep breath, get comfortable wherever you're at, and let's talk about it. Because there is a phrase that shows up again and again when relationships start to strain. Men often say something like, there's a lack of sex. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable, neutral, maybe even justified. But most of the time, what that phrase actually means is there isn't as much sex as there used to be. And the issue isn't from a lack of desire either, in case if you were wondering. The issue is what that phrase quietly reduces intimacy to. Because when sex is described as lacking, intimacy starts getting framed as access, while everything that creates true intimacy has already begun to fade. Intimacy isn't just physical contact, it's emotional safety, consistency, feeling chosen instead of managed, feeling met instead of tolerated, feeling like a partner, not a resource. When those things disappear, sex doesn't vanish randomly, it responds. For many women, not all, but many, desire is deeply tied to emotional safety. Men, I need you to pay attention to this part because it matters. It's not in a dramatic way, not in a transactional way, in a nervous system way. A woman's willingness to continue offering herself physically, emotionally, erotically, often depends on whether it feels safe to stay open, safe enough to be vulnerable, to be imperfect, to be honest, to be soft without being punished for it. When the emotional environment becomes unpredictable, critical, distant, or one-sided, her body notices before her mind does. She doesn't stop wanting intimacy because she's cold or withholding. She stops because her nervous system is literally telling her it's not safe to keep giving like this. From the outside, it looks like she just doesn't want sex anymore. But internally, it often sounds like, I no longer feel emotionally held. I only feel seen when something is needed from me. I'm carrying the emotional labor and the sexual responsibility in the relationship. I'm tired of being receptive while holding the weight of everything else. When emotional safety erodes, sex can start to feel like another demand to her, another expectation of her, another place she has to give without being met. So her body pulls back, not out of punishment, but out of self-preservation. And here's what isn't talked about enough. Physical intimacy is almost never the first thing to die in a relationship. It's the last signal. It's not the starting point, but it's also the part that gets noticed by men the most. Before bodies disconnect, minds disconnect. Before desire fades, presence fades. Maybe you're spending less time with that person. And by the time sex becomes a talking point, there's usually been years of quiet emotional erosion. And that erosion doesn't happen through explosive fights. It happens quietly through never being chosen, never being prioritized, never being considered before everyone and everything else. There usually aren't blow-ups or dramatic ultimatums in the beginning. There was neglect and years of it. Years of not being prioritized over the friends. Years of plans being flexible when it came to you, but immovable when it came to his friends. You become the option that could wait, the person who would understand, the one who is expected to accommodate. And slowly but quietly, that teaches your nervous system something. It teaches you that you are not the center of the relationship. You are the background. Everything described so far, the loss of safety, the quiet withdrawal, the feeling of carrying intimacy alone, doesn't happen on its own. It happens alongside something much harder to name. Emotional presence, leaving while physical presence stays, is something that I like to call the emotional checkout. They don't walk out. They don't announce anything. They don't make a dramatic exit. They stay. They're still in the house, still in the relationship, still moving through the daily routine, but they are no longer relationally present. They checked out mentally, relationally, emotionally. And because their body never leaves, it's really easy to miss. At first, the shift is subtle. They ask fewer meaningful questions, not, how was your day? But follow-ups instead. Curiosity fades. They stop wondering about her inner world. Listening changes too. They listen just enough to reply, but not enough to understand. Presence gets replaced with multitasking. Conversations happen alongside cell phones, televisions, scrolling on social media, distractions, distractions, distractions. Connection starts feeling like it's competing for attention instead of being the thing that gets it. And over time, they also stop initiating connection that isn't outcome driven. If there's no goal, no resolution, no convenience, no sex, they disengage. Emotional closeness becomes something they tolerate, not something that they pursue. But here's the part that matters. Their expectations don't change. They still want the affection. They still want the access. They still want the physical closeness. They want the benefits of intimacy without participating in the emotional labor that sustains it. And this creates a quiet imbalance because intimacy can't be sustained on availability alone. Presence without participation still feels like absence. What's happening isn't cruelty, it's avoidance. Avoidance of emotional presence, avoidance of discomfort, avoidance of responsibility for connection. And when one partner slowly disengages in this way, without naming it, without correcting it, without taking ownership, they aren't just creating distance. They're creating the conditions where intimacy cannot and will not survive. Not because the other person refuses connection, but because connection requires two people actively showing up. And when that imbalance finally fractures something, when closeness collapses under the weight of one-sided effort, an explanation often rushes in to smooth it all over. Not accountability, not curiosity, not grief for what went unattended, but a familiar refrain, sometimes offered as wisdom rather than asked as a question. What did you think was going to happen? He's a man, and a man has needs. It's framed as instinct, as something that's inevitable, as something that's learned early and rarely examined. In a single sentence, emotional absence is completely erased. It's erased years of disconnection. And entitlement is recast as nature. The relationship itself is no longer interrogated, only the unmet expectation. And that's how quiet withdrawal, left unnamed and unchallenged, becomes justified, not just by the person who disengaged, but reinforced by the voices that taught him what should be expected without requiring reflection. This is where entitlement doesn't just emerge, it's affirmed. This is where entitlement quietly enters the relationship, not loudly, not aggressively, not as a declaration. It slips in when curiosity disappears. Instead of asking, what's happening between us, or how have I contributed to this distance, the focus slowly shifts to frustration. Attention moves away from the relationship itself and fixates on a single question: why am I not getting what I want? They begin noticing what's missing: less affection, less intimacy, less warmth, without noticing what they stopped offering along the way. The emotional presence, the attunement, the effort that it takes to stay connected. It's work. Relationships are work. The relationship becomes measured by output, not participation. And quietly, something else happens. When intimacy is reduced to something that's owed, when connection is treated like a service rather than a shared experience, betrayal starts to feel explainable, even warranted. Not because the relationship was nurtured and still failed, but because effort was withdrawn, emotional presence was neglected, and the woman was slowly reduced to a role rather than recognized as a person. Her needs blurred into the background. Her exhaustion went unregistered. Her value became conditional, tied to what she could provide rather than who she was. Meanwhile, the woman adapts. And this part is important. She usually doesn't raise alarms right away. She doesn't issue ultimatums either. She doesn't stop loving. She compensates. She becomes the keeper of the emotional climate. She tracks moods, anticipates tension, monitors timing, initiates repair time and time again, and she explains it gently. She rephrases. She brings things up carefully. She waits. She does this quietly, not because it feels good, but because she values peace more than conflict, because she's still invested in the relationship. But over time, something shifts. When one person is carrying all of the emotional awareness, the emotional maintenance, the emotional repair, connection stops feeling mutual. It becomes work. It's another job. Let's be honest, work doesn't feel romantic. It doesn't feel playful. It doesn't feel free. It feels heavy. It feels lonely. And here's where entitlement solidifies. The partner who disengaged emotionally still expects closeness, still expects affection, still expects access without recognizing that intimacy requires contribution, not entitlement. Because when effort turns one-sided, desire doesn't disappear out of cruelty, it withholds itself out of exhaustion. One of the fastest ways to kill intimacy isn't anger. It isn't conflict. It isn't even disagreement. It's emotional inconsistency. Showing up when things are easy, checking out when things are hard, being present when the relationship feels good, and absent the moment discomfort appears. Affection becomes conditional. Connection becomes intermittent. Attention shows up when something is wanted, like sex, reassurance, closeness. But it withdraws when self-reflection is required. When accountability enters the room, presence leaves it. That inconsistency doesn't create desire, it creates insecurity. Because emotional safety isn't built on intensity, it's built on predictability. A person doesn't need perfection. They need to know, will you still be here emotionally when it's inconvenient for you? When emotional availability turns on and off, the nervous system never settles. It's always alert. It's braced for impact. It's waiting for the inevitable withdrawal. And over time, that vigilance erodes attraction. Not because the partner is punishing, but because desire doesn't thrive in uncertainty. This is also where language becomes dangerous, because when emotional neglect gets renamed as a lack of intimacy, it doesn't just describe the problem, it redirects it. Labeling the issue as sex provides the cover. Sex becomes the focus because it's simpler than accountability. Talking about sex avoids talking about emotional absence, avoidance of difficult conversations, commitment, inconsistent effort, unaddressed resentment. Framing the issue as physical keeps the emotional work completely off the table. So instead of asking, what happens to me when I'm uncomfortable, or why do I disappear during emotional tension, the focus becomes, why isn't she giving me what I want? And that reframing matters because once intimacy is reduced to sex, everything else gets dismissed as irrelevant. The years of disengagement don't have to be examined anymore. The lack of presence doesn't have to be addressed anymore. The relational imbalance stays unnamed. Calling it a lack of intimacy sounds neutral, sounds reasonable, maybe even medical, but it sidesteps responsibility because intimacy isn't something that breaks on its own. It dissolves when emotional consistency disappears, when effort fluctuates, when repair is optional, when connection depends on convenience. And the more this language takes hold, the easier it is to believe that the problem is her desire instead of the problem being the emotional environment. That's how accountability gets replaced with frustration. And that's how the deeper rupture, the one that actually needs attention, remains untouched. Sometimes this rebranding doesn't stop at avoidance. Sometimes it escalates into justification. Instead of saying, I betrayed my partner, the story quietly shifts to, I wasn't getting my needs met. And that shift matters because the first statement acknowledges choice, responsibility, and harm. The second reframes betrayal as a reaction. Cheating stops being something that somebody did and becomes something that happened to them, a symptom, a consequence, a result. And notice what disappears from the narrative: the years of emotional disengagement, the avoidance of difficult conversations and commitment, the refusal to participate in relationship repair, the moments where presence was optional. None of that makes it into the story now. And instead, desire becomes permission, loneliness becomes absolution, pain becomes a justification rather than something to tend to honestly. And this framing is powerful because it removes accountability. If the problem is that needs weren't met, then betrayal feels understandable, maybe even acceptable. If dissatisfaction is centered, dishonesty feels excusable. But dissatisfaction doesn't erase obligation, and loneliness doesn't nullify integrity. Feeling unmet does not entitle someone to actively deceive. Neglect, real or perceived, does not justify betrayal because cheating isn't caused by a lack of sex. It's caused by a choice to avoid hard conversations, personal responsibility, and relational repair. And here's the uncomfortable truth: many people don't cheat because their relationship was already dead. They cheat because they didn't want to face the work required to revive it, or the courage required to leave it honestly. Language that frames betrayal as what I was driven to do doesn't just soften guilt, it erases the partner who was never given full information, a chance to respond, or the respect of an honest ending. Harm doesn't become less harmful because there was dissatisfaction beforehand. And reframing betrayal as a consequence instead of a choice doesn't make it kinder. It just makes it easier to live with. There is a moment, quiet moment, and an internal moment when a woman stops trying to carry the relationship by herself. It doesn't happen during a fight. It doesn't come with a glaring announcement. There's no threat. There's no ultimatum. She doesn't say, if this doesn't change, I'm leaving. She just stops. She stops reaching. She stops initiating conversations that go nowhere. She stops reminding them. She stops going to their house all of the time. She stops adjusting herself to avoid conflict. Not because she stopped caring, but because she got tired of caring alone. This moment is almost always invisible to the other partner because from the outside, she looks calm, functional, less emotional, less demanding. And that can be misread as improvement. But internally, what's actually happening is very different. She's no longer investing with the hope that things will change. She's conserving her energy. She's protecting herself, redirecting her emotional attention inward because trying over and over without being met teaches her something. It teaches her that effort won't be reciprocated, that her reaching doesn't land, that repair isn't mutual, and that realization marks a shift. By the time intimacy noticeably disappears, she has already been grieving the relationship quietly, privately, in pieces. She has grieved the relationship she thought she had, the version of her partner that she kept believing would reappear, the future that she kept working toward alone. This grief isn't loud, it's practical. It looks like, I can't keep doing this to myself. I have to stop hoping. And here's the part that often gets misunderstood. Sex didn't leave first. Hope left first. Hope that her feelings would actually matter to him. Hope that showing up would be mutual. Hope that emotional presence would become consistent. When hope leaves, desire doesn't even stand a chance. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, but because longing requires belief, and belief can't survive where effort feels one-sided. By the time a man says, I don't understand when things changed, she often thinks, they changed a long time ago. You just didn't feel it yet. Accountability isn't shame, it's awareness. It asks, where did I disengage? Where did I avoid? Where did I expect effort without offering it? Intimacy isn't owed, it's cultivated. And when it fades, the real question isn't, how do I get it back? It's, what did I stop tending to? This episode was focused on our men, on how entitlement often shows up on one side of the relationship through emotional withdrawal, avoidance, and expectation without participation. But entitlement doesn't exist in isolation either. It survives in a system. It takes two to tango. So in part 2, we're turning the tables on the women to the other side of that dynamic. We're going to talk about what happens when a woman has been hurt in the past and how it doesn't lead to leaving, but it leads to adapting. When her pain turns into endurance, when that endurance over time starts to shift into control. Because sometimes when needs go unmet and unspoken for far too long, they don't just disappear, they evolve. They can show up as leverage, manipulation, as quiet resentment, as subtle forms of power. And sometimes they show up as protection. Because when someone has been hurt so deeply in the past, they don't just move forward, they guard themselves. And that guard can become so strong that the person in front of them, unfortunately, the men, end up paying for what somebody else did. Not intentionally, but in the hesitation, in the assumptions that everybody's just going to do the same thing, and the need to stay one step ahead so that they never get caught off guard again. And in that space, connection can slowly turn into strategy where reassurance becomes something that we try to secure instead of something that we feel, where influence turns into control, and where at times we may even test, challenge, or subtly diminish our partner just to regain a sense of power that we once lost. Not as blame, but as awareness, because entitlement isn't only enforced by those who expect too much, it's also sustained by what gets absorbed, managed, and carried in silence. And agency means recognizing not just what was done to us, but how we respond to it. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If this episode made you think, reflect, or feel seen, share it with somebody who values deep conversations like I do. And if you want to continue the dialogue, you can always reach me at ce.spillingtea@gmail.com. I'll see you in part 2 when being hurt turns into power. Stay curious, my friends.